Cody was only 9 when he first saw the eyes of a horse chained beneath the earth. Its gaze, sunken, cold, reflected the same loneliness he had buried for years. But he never expected that tangled in its mane was evidence of a hidden murder. And when Cody chose not to stay silent, justice began to rise from the dust. If you think this is just a story about a boy and a horse, you're wrong. Hit subscribe now and don't miss the powerful episodes ahead. Under the blistering Nevada sun, the desert winds howled across the vast emptiness like a warning whispered through the bones of the earth. Dust twisted in silent whirlwinds over cracked ground, dragging dead twigs and ghostly whispers from the past along with it. In the middle of this forsaken land, nestled between patches of sagebrush and rusted fences, stood a lonely grave marked with a simple wooden cross. No name, just the burned-in initials, EJ, and the faint trace of a carved horseshoe underneath. 9-year-old Cody Jensen sat beside it, legs pulled to his chest, chin resting on his knees. His flannel shirt, 2 sizes too big, rippled slightly in the wind. He didn't cry. Cody didn't cry anymore. Not since the day the ground swallowed up the only person who'd ever called him champ. His grandfather hadn't been a perfect man, but he'd been the only anchor Cody had in a world that seemed hell-bent on forgetting kids like him existed. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the rim of a cracked dog tag he wore around his neck, the only thing he'd kept after the funeral. It used to belong to his grandpa's horse, Bandit. Now, it was a memory, cool against his skin, the only metal in his life that didn't feel like a chain. The distant clatter of something shifting in the wind broke his daze. He glanced toward the old storage shed by the edge of the dry ravine, once a barn, now just a collapsing skeleton of wood and rust. The wind had pushed one of its warped doors partially open, and for a moment, Cody could swear he heard movement. Not the scraping wind, not the sigh of tin, something heavier, something alive. He stood slowly, brushing the sand off his jeans. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he took a step toward the shed. It wasn't the first time he'd wandered here since the funeral. But today felt different. He could feel it in his chest, a kind of tightness he didn't have words for, like he was stepping into something that had been waiting a long time. The closer he got, the more the air seemed to shift. The usual scent of scorched earth and grease was cut by something rawer. Decay, dampness, time. The shed groaned as he pushed the door wider. Shafts of light filtered through the slats, catching dust in golden strands. Cody stepped carefully across the creaking floorboards, past stacks of old tack and forgotten tools, until he reached the back wall, where a wide crack split the foundation like a wound. It was jagged, unnatural, the kind of thing people should have noticed and fixed, but no one had. Like everything else around here, it had been abandoned. He crouched, pressing his ear toward the crack. There it was again, a sound, a low, rhythmic exhale, muffled, faint, alive. Something deep inside the earth was breathing. Cody's heart pounded. He slid his fingers along the edge of the fissure and pushed. The old stone gave way slightly, enough to reveal a gap barely wide enough for his body. He hesitated for half a second, then slipped through. The descent was rough. He landed in a pile of dirt and crumbling wood, his flashlight flickering wildly as it clattered to the floor. He scrambled to grab it, heart in his throat. When the beam steadied, what he saw stopped him cold. The space he'd entered was a chamber carved out of the rock, walls wet with condensation despite the desert heat above. The air was dense, thick with silence, except for the sound he'd heard, that steady, heavy breathing. And there, chained to the far wall, stood the most haunting creature he had ever seen. A white horse, skeletal and trembling, eyes reflecting the beam of Cody's flashlight like mirrors. Its body was scraped raw in places, the once smooth coat now dull, dirty, streaked with dried blood and mud. But it wasn't the injuries that made Cody freeze. It was the eyes. They were still alive. Terrified, yes. But not broken, not yet. The horse didn't move when Cody took a step forward. Its chain clinked lightly, taut against the bolt embedded in the stone. Cody raised the light slowly, following the rusted links to a crude iron collar around the animal's neck. His breath caught. Who would do this? Why? He knelt slowly, trying not to startle the animal. "Hey," he whispered, barely audible. "Hey there, big guy. Or girl. I don't know what you are, but..." The horse blinked, and then, like a slow, surreal moment from a dream, it lowered its head, as if recognizing something, as if surrendering not out of defeat, but relief. Cody reached out a shaky hand, not sure what he was doing, not sure if he was insane, but his fingers brushed against the coarse fur of the horse's cheek. It was warm and trembling. He sucked in a breath, realizing he was crying. Something about the stillness of the animal, the quiet strength in that silence, it cracked something open inside him. All the grief, all the loneliness, All the nights lying awake in that trailer, listening to his father yell at nothing. All the days being ignored, dismissed, written off as a troublemaker or a weird kid. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. Cody moved around slowly, examining the chain. It was thick, rusted but solid, bolted into the wall with a steel ring welded into the rock. He couldn't break it, not with his bare hands. But maybe. His eyes darted across the chamber, searching. A rotted crate lay near the corner. He popped it open, finding splinters, nails, and a rusted crowbar. It wasn't much. But it was hope. He returned to the horse, still unmoving, watching him with those impossibly human eyes. "Okay," Cody murmured. "I'm gonna help you, I promise. But I gotta go for now. I need tools, water, food. I'll come back, I swear." He turned to leave, then paused. Hanging in the horse's tangled mane was something fabric? No, a torn piece of canvas, wrapped around something small and stiff. Curious, he reached up and gently pulled it loose. It was an envelope, sealed in plastic, weathered with age but intact. On the front, scrawled in faded black ink, "To whoever finds him, tell the truth." No name, no return address, just those words. Cody's heart thudded as he slipped the envelope into his pocket. He looked back at the horse who hadn't moved, but whose eyes now followed him with an eerie kind of focus, like it knew, like it remembered. As Cody climbed back out of the fissure and emerged into the late afternoon light, he turned to look over his shoulder. The crack in the shed wall loomed behind him like an eye, half closed, watching everything. He wasn't sure what he had just stepped into, but something buried was breathing again, and its heartbeat was loud. Under the low-hanging ceiling of a trailer that smelled like cigarettes, motor oil, and broken dreams, Cody sat on the edge of the stained couch, his fingers wrapped tightly around the envelope he'd found knotted in the mane of a dying white horse beneath the earth. The television buzzed faintly with the static hum of late-afternoon sports commentary. On the recliner, half asleep and fully drunk, slouched Randy Jensen, Cody's father. His boots were still on, caked with dry dirt, legs splayed open. An almost empty bottle of wild turkey teetered on the armrest like a dare. His belly rose and fell beneath a grease-stained t-shirt, and the gray in his beard had begun to outpace the black. His eyes, when open, never really looked at anything. "Dad," Cody said softly. No response. He tried again, louder. "Dad, I need to tell you something." A grunt. One eye opened, watery and red. "What? You break something? You in trouble at school again?" I found something. Near the old shed, by Grandpa's grave." Randy rubbed his face, grimaced, and sat up just enough to reach for his drink. "You weren't supposed to be out that far. There's a horse, Dad." Cody's voice caught, but he pushed through. "It's trapped, down there, like someone chained it up and left it to die." That woke Randy up. The recliner squeaked violently as he shifted forward. His eyes snapped toward Cody like a whip. "You what?" "I found a horse," Cody repeated, chest tightening. "A white one. It's in bad shape. Really bad. But alive. And someone locked it in, I think for years." Randy stood abruptly, the bottle falling and shattering against the floor. Cody flinched as the sharp sound echoed through the trailer. "You listen to me," Randy growled, his voice a low tremor. "You stay the hell away from that place. Do you hear me? Don't go digging around in what's not yours." Cody blinked. "But Dad, it's just a horse. It needs help. It's dying." Randy's fist slammed into the wall beside Cody's head, loud and final. "I said don't." The silence afterward was suffocating. Cody looked up at his father's face, the anger etched into it. But more than that, the fear. It was the first time Cody had seen that expression on him. Not drunken rage, not frustration, not even disgust, but real, trembling fear. And he didn't understand it. Randy pulled back, breathing hard. He rubbed the heel of his palm over his eyes like trying to erase something. "Go to your room." Cody didn't move. "You know something, don't you?" Randy didn't answer. Just turned away and began picking up the broken glass with trembling fingers. That night, the wind outside howled like it was trying to tear the trailer off its foundation. Cody couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling for hours, the horse's eyes still seared into his brain. Whisper, he'd started calling it because the sound of its breathing, its stillness, its gaze, spoke louder than anything else he'd ever heard. The envelope sat under his pillow. He hadn't opened it yet. It felt like something sacred, something dangerous. And more than anything, it felt like proof of what he didn't yet know. But it was a thread, and he was going to pull it. The next morning, Cody waited for Randy to pass out again before grabbing his backpack, a few apples, a plastic bottle of water, and his flashlight. He stuffed the envelope inside a comic book in case his bag got searched. Then he slipped out. The way back to the cracked shed was faster now. His feet knew the path by instinct. Each step was surer than the last. anger pushing him forward. He crawled through the fissure like a boy chasing the last light before it vanished. Whisper was still there, but standing now. Head low, but alert. Cody approached slowly, holding out an apple. "Hey buddy, I told you I'd come back." Whisper took the fruit carefully, chewing with visible effort. His ribs still jutted out like fence posts, but there was something new in his stance, a flicker of belief. As Cody refilled the chipped bowl with water, he noticed something else too. The horse's eyes weren't as clouded. They caught the light now. They were watching him, not with fear, but with recognition. Every day for the next week, Cody returned. He skipped school, told no one, brought carrots, cleaned the space a little. Whisper never moved far, he couldn't far, chained as he was, but the life in him seemed to grow with every visit. And every night, Randy drank deeper. His silences grew longer. Once, Cody heard him pacing outside the trailer at 3 a.m., muttering something about Boone and the auction. The next morning, the back door was dented from where Randy had kicked it. That night, Cody finally opened the envelope. Inside were 3 items: a faded black and white photo of a man standing beside a younger, Whisper, healthier, strong, wearing a sheriff's saddle. The back read, Richard Boone, 2009. A typed sheet, partially torn, labeled Nevada Livestock Auction Transfer, Cancelled. A handwritten note, scrawled in frantic cursive. "They think I'm bluffing, that I'll take the buyout and walk. But that horse saw everything. That horse is the last piece. If something happens to me, find him. Find the horse. He knows." Cody's stomach twisted. He had heard that name before. Boone. Grandpa used to spit it out like it tasted bitter. Something about land thieves and blood in the dirt. But this was a death note. A few days later, Cody made a mistake. He left his backpack in the kitchen when Randy came home early. He heard the trailer go silent, then heard the rustle of paper, the scrape of the chair as his father sat down, the creak of the floorboard behind him. Cody turned slowly. Randy was holding the photo of Boone, and shaking. "You've been back there," Randy said, voice hollow. Cody stood his ground. "Every day." A long silence. Then Randy's voice broke. "You don't understand what you're messing with." "Then tell me," Cody snapped. "Tell me why that horse is chained up under our land. Tell me why Grandpa's name is on one of those auction papers." Randy sat down, heavy as a man twice his size. "Because your grandpa tried to do the right thing. Once." He took a breath. The kind people take when they're about to exhume something they've buried for years. "Boone was a crooked bastard," Randy muttered. "But he owned half this damn valley. Had plans to sell the land for drilling, make millions. Your grandpa found out. Threatened to expose it. Boone got desperate, started threatening people, animals, used that damn horse as bait. Till one night, Boone didn't make it home." Cody's chest throbbed. "You mean he was murdered?" Randy didn't answer, but his silence was thunder. "And Grandpa? Didn't pull the trigger," Randy said, "but he knew, and so did that horse." Whisper was the only witness. "Your grandpa said, 'Animals, remember, they don't lie.' So, you locked him down there." Randy looked at his son, the shame bleeding into every wrinkle on his face. "I chained him," he whispered. "I couldn't kill him, but I couldn't let him go either. That horse was proof, and proof gets people killed." Cody stepped back, cold crawling up his spine. "You lied to me. You lied to everyone." "I was protecting you," Randy muttered. You were protecting yourself." The silence between them stretched so tight it could have snapped the sky. Then Cody turned and walked out the door. Behind him, Randy didn't call out, didn't follow, didn't fight. Just sat in the dark, with the bottle, the lies, and the long shadow of the truth catching up to him. The wind at Carson Middle School never seemed to stop howling. It whistled through broken window panes, lifted the edge of forgotten homework across the cracked pavement, and blew sand into the eyes of kids who didn't have the luxury of being invisible. Or, in June Taylor's case, didn't have the luxury of being liked. June was used to being looked at sideways. She didn't wear name brands. Her shoes were cracked at the toes. She didn't talk much unless she was cornered, and when she did, her voice was too soft for most to care. Her mother, Marla, worked at one of the last functioning stables on the south end of the valley, scrubbing manure off boots and mucking stalls for men who never said thank you. That morning, as kids clustered around the vending machines before homeroom, one of the 8th grade boys, "Thank you, Granger," always loud and mean, called across the hallway. "Hey, June, tell your mom thanks for cleaning my dad's boots. He says she missed a spot." Laughter. Not much, but enough. June kept walking. She didn't cry. She never did in front of them. Behind the bleachers during lunch, she sat alone, sketching horses in a dog-eared notebook. They were always in motion, rearing, galloping, kicking down fences. Sometimes she gave them wings. That's where Cody found her. He stood awkwardly a few feet away, a peanut butter sandwich clutched in one hand, his other jammed into his hoodie pocket. "Hey." June looked up, blinked. "Hi." He shuffled closer. "You like horses?" She raised an eyebrow. "Why?" He hesitated, then sat down beside her. "I found one. Sort of." That got her attention. "What do you mean, sort of?" It's under the ground," Cody said. "Like in a cave. Behind my grandpa's shed, there's this crack, and I climbed down. It's chained up, white, big. I think it's dying." June stared at him. Her eyes didn't narrow in disbelief. They didn't laugh or scoff or roll. They just locked in. "You're serious." Cody nodded. "Most people would think you're crazy," June said slowly. "You don't?" "I think you're telling the truth," she said. And then, with quiet defiance, "And I know what it's like when nobody listens." Cody exhaled like he'd been holding that breath for days. That afternoon, they cut school together. Cody led her across the back trails, where the desert scrub thinned and the land began to sink into itself. They passed rusted oil drums, the carcass of a burned-out pickup, and a long stretch of barbed wire fence tangled in tumbleweed. By the time they reached the shed, the sun had dipped into a slant, casting long, sharp shadows. June looked at the building like it was a test. "What's under there?" "You'll see." Inside, the air was thick with dust and rot. Cody moved with purpose, brushing aside boards and crates to reveal the cracked stone behind. "You sure you want to go down?" June shrugged off her backpack. "Let's do it." They lowered themselves into the darkness, one after the other, flashlights casting jittery halos against the rock. And then she saw it. Whisper stood in the corner, head lowered, unmoving. June's mouth opened slightly. "Oh my God." She stepped forward slowly, instinctively, the way someone approaches a wounded animal. "Hey there," she whispered. "It's okay. We're not here to hurt you." Whisper shifted, just slightly, enough to acknowledge her presence. "I've never seen one like this," she said, almost reverently. "He's huge. And those eyes, they weren't like that before," Cody said. "He used to look dead. Now he watches." June knelt, reached into her bag, pulled out a half-eaten apple. Whisper sniffed it, then took it gently from her hand. "He trusts you," Cody said. "He's starving," she replied. "But yeah, maybe a little." As they moved about the chamber, trying to clean up the space, Cody's flashlight caught something on the far wall, a smear, faint but unmistakable. He moved closer. "Is that blood?" June approached, eyes narrowing. "Looks old, dried, but not animal. That's too high up." She pointed to a dark streak leading to a collapsed beam. "That's human height." Cody's pulse ticked up. Jesus. He turned toward the corner, where a crumpled tarp and a few pieces of rotted canvas sat forgotten. Digging through it, he found a strip of paper, brittle and stained. He held it to the light. A partial heading. Boone Ranch Holdings. The rest was unreadable. "Boone?" Cody whispered. "That's the name on the photo I found." June looked sharply at him. "What photo?" He pulled the envelope from his pocket, opened it carefully, and handed it to her. She examined the contents with the meticulous gaze of someone used to studying things nobody else noticed. "This is real," she said, "and dangerous." "What do you mean?" She pointed to the typed sheet. "Auction cancellation. That means a sale was stopped last minute, probably due to a legal dispute. Boone, whoever he was trying to sell something someone else wanted hidden. This could be why he ended up dead." Cody felt the walls press in. "I think my dad was involved," he said, barely above a whisper. "I think he knows more than he says." June didn't flinch. "Then we need to find out what Whisper knows." They turned toward the horse, who was now watching them with something closer to comprehension. Cody stepped closer, stroking his mane, and that's when his hand brushed against something odd. A bulge, tangled in the thick strands of hair. "What's that?" "I don't know," Cody said, fingers working gently. It took a few minutes, but he finally pulled free a small, dirty cloth bag, bound tight with twine. He looked at June. "You want to do the honors?" She took it, untied the knot, and emptied the contents onto the ground. Out spilled. A crumpled check stub made out to R. Boone for $10,000 from an unnamed LLC. A photograph, blurry, but clear enough to show 3 men standing beside a truck. One of them was Boone. Another, unmistakably, was Randy. And at the bottom, folded and smudged but legible, a contract. Boone Ranch Holdings Ownership Transfer Clause. Signed by Boone. And countersigned by Paul Lewis. Cody's stomach dropped. "Lewis is my uncle," he said, voice cold. "My dad's brother-in-law. They covered it up together," June whispered. And Whisper, he saw it all. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then June stood up, dusted off her knees. "We have to keep this safe," Cody nodded. "And we have to find out what the hell happened the night Boone died." Whisper whinnied softly behind them, and the sound felt more like an oath than a cry. He wasn't forgotten, and now, neither were they. Cody didn't knock. He pushed the trailer door open hard enough that it slammed against the wall and bounced back. Randy, half slouched on the couch, startled upright, spilling a trail of bourbon across the front of his shirt. Jesus, what the hell? You chained that horse to cover for Paul Lewis, Cody said, standing in the narrow entryway like a shadow cast by something older than him. And you've lied to me every day since. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It roared. Randy stood slowly. The look on his face twisted between confusion and something harder, more dangerous. He wiped his hand across his mouth. You don't know what the hell you're talking about. Cody pulled the crumpled contract and photo from his back pocket and tossed them onto the coffee table. They slid across the stained wood like bullets. I do now? Randy stared. The photo a freeze frame of a murder's shadow. Boone, the truck, him, Paul. The color drained from his face. You went back down there, he said hoarsely. You dragged that filth into this house? You put it there, Cody shouted. You buried it. Whisper was a living thing, and you left him down there like trash. Randy's hand moved before his mind did. It was a reflex, a flash, a scar memory. His palm cracked across Cody's cheek with a sound that split the room. Cody stumbled back against the counter, hand flying to his face. The sting lit his skin like fire. Everything stopped. The silence afterward was worse than the blow. Randy's breath caught. His hand hovered mid-air, shaking. He looked at Cody, then he looked at his own hand, like it didn't belong to him anymore. Cody, he started, voice brittle. Cody didn't answer. His cheek burned red, tears welling not from pain, but from betrayal too deep to scream out. You hit me, Cody whispered, just like he used to hit you. Randy sat down hard, as if the weight of that sentence crushed him. Cody didn't wait for an apology. He walked to the table, picked up the photo, and turned it so Randy had no choice but to look. Was it worth it? He asked, barely breathing. Selling your soul to a man who would kill for land? Randy's eyes darted from the image to Cody's face, and for a second, something cracked. Not rage, not pride, but grief. Boone wasn't supposed to die, Randy said, like someone reciting a nightmare they never woke from. Paul just wanted to scare him, make him pull out of the deal. But Boone, he fought. They got into it, and Paul, he had a pipe. Hit him once, just once. It didn't even look bad. We thought he'd be okay. Cody's heart thudded. But he didn't get up, Randy continued, voice falling into itself. He started choking. There was blood. I froze. Paul said we had to get rid of the body, that the cops would never believe it was an accident, not with his record. Cody's voice came in low. So you hid the body? Randy didn't answer. Cody stepped closer. And, Whisper? Randy's face fell apart. That damn horse wouldn't stop following us. He'd seen the whole thing. He kept showing up near the shed. The men from the land company were due that week. We panicked. Paul said, if we didn't shut that horse up, it'd lead the cops straight to us. Your grandfather refused, said the horse had more decency than any of us. Cody's eyes burned. So Grandpa knew. He threatened to go to the police. Randy nodded. But then, Boone's body disappeared. What? I went back the next morning and it was gone. No tracks, no blood trail. Just gone. Your grandpa thought someone was watching us, said he wasn't going down for someone else's sin. So he didn't chain Whisper, Cody said. Randy shook his head, slowly. Number I did. The air left the room. I waited until your grandfather left town for the vet, took the horse down through the ravine, and he broke off, choked. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought if there was no witness, then maybe we could start over. Maybe the land would stay in the family. Cody looked at him like he was staring through a stranger. That wasn't about starting over. That was about survival. Yours, not mine. Randy's hands trembled as he grabbed the bottle again. Don't, Cody said. Don't hide behind that. Randy stopped mid-pour. You're right, he said. I'm a coward. I let Paul talk me into silence. I didn't kill Boone, but I killed who I used to be the second I wrapped that chain around that horse's neck. The confession didn't land like redemption. It landed like cement. You made me believe he was imaginary, Cody said. You made me question myself. I couldn't bear it, Randy said, barely audible. Every time you looked at me with those eyes, your mother's eyes, I saw what I was. Cody blinked. You think that makes it okay? Number. They sat in the standoff of broken bloodlines, the trailer echoing with what hadn't been said for years. I loved you, Dad, Cody said, finally. I still do. That's what makes it hurt. Randy looked up, the first tear tracing through the grime on his cheek. I never stopped loving you. Cody nodded, but his eyes no longer held fire. They held pity. Not for what Randy had done, but for what he'd become, a man trapped in the ruins of his own choices. A man who once rode horses and kissed his wife's temple in the morning and called his son Champ, now reduced to a flickering television and a bottle half full of denial. Cody stood. I'm going to the sheriff, he said. I'm telling them everything. Randy didn't argue. He only whispered, "Tell them I chained the horse, not your grandpa." "I will." Cody turned toward the door. "Cody," Randy called, voice breaking. The boy paused. "If I never see you again." "You will," Cody said. "Just not like this." Then he walked out, and the wind took the door shut behind him. The next morning, the hallways of Carson Middle were unusually quiet. Cody stood by the faculty lounge door, heart thudding in his chest like hooves pounding the desert floor. He could hear the hum of fluorescent lights, the far-off screech of a locker slamming shut, and the buzz in his ears that always came when fear met conviction. In his hands, wrapped tightly in a worn manila folder, were the papers, the contract, the photo, the check stub, the blood-stained name of Boone Ranch Holdings, the pieces of a truth too long buried in dry Nevada dust. The door opened before he knocked. "Cody?" Mr. Graham stood in the doorway, holding a steaming mug of coffee and a binder of graded essays. A tall man, in his 60s, with storm-gray hair pulled into a short ponytail and a mustache that had seen better decades. His cardigan was peppered with chalk dust, and his eyes carried the weight of someone who had read too many tragedies and watched too few resolve. Cody cleared his throat. "I need your help." Something in his voice made Graham step aside without asking a question. Inside the lounge, the air was thick with burnt coffee and the faint scent of dry erase markers. Cody placed the folder on the table and slowly unfolded the contents. Graham watched. As the papers spilled out, something shifted in his face. A stillness took over. The kind of stillness Cody imagined happened in the seconds between lightning and thunder. "I found them," Cody said, "in the mane of a horse that's been chained under my grandfather's shed for over a decade." Graham said nothing for a long moment. He picked up the photo first. His hand trembled. "That's Boone," he whispered. "And Randy, and Paul." Cody nodded. "My dad said it was supposed to be an accident, that they panicked, that the horse saw." Graham turned the photo over. The date scribbled in faded ink. The edges curled. The silence deepened. "I remember this day," Graham said finally. "Boone had come by the school to ask me about starting a community youth program. Wanted to use his ranch as a place for kids who'd gotten in trouble. Said land was for healing, not hoarding. A week later, he vanished." He turned to Cody, eyes heavy. "And no one ever asked questions, because the desert eats secrets." Cody leaned forward, but Whisper remembered. Graham looked at him sharply. "The horse, that's his name," Cody said. He didn't forget. He waited. A long breath escaped the teacher's chest. "I knew your grandfather," he said. "Not just in passing. We were kids together. Rode bikes down Dry Wash Canyon. Got caught sneaking into the old movie house. He was the one who taught me that silence isn't neutral, that it's a weapon when used by the wrong hands." Graham ran his fingers across the check stub. "Do you know what this is, Cody?" "A payment," Cody said. "To shut someone up." Graham nodded. "And this," he held up the contract, "is the land transfer that never made it through, because Boone was killed." He stared at the papers for a moment longer, then reached into the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. He flipped to a dog-eared page and handed it to Cody. The quote at the top read, "Justice rarely shouts. It waits beneath layers of shame, silence, and soil." Below it was a title, "The Quiet Verdict," a personal essay by Elijah Jensen, Cody's grandfather. Cody's throat tightened. "Your grandpa submitted this to the Carson Literary Review in 2095, Graham said softly. "It was about a ranch hand accused of stealing cattle. He hadn't. But everyone assumed he had, so no one asked questions. He lost everything." Years later, it turned out the real thief was the sheriff's cousin. Elijah never forgave himself for staying quiet. Cody stared at the page. The words trembled in his hands. "I thought I was just saving a horse," he said. "You're not," Graham said, eyes steady. "You're digging through the caked-over soul of this town, of your family. You're dragging it into the daylight." June knocked once and entered the lounge without waiting. Cody looked up. "You ready?" She held up a notepad, already filled with dates, summaries, and scribbled annotations. "We've got timelines, testimonies, and maps of Boone's ranch," she said. "And we're not done." Graham watched the two of them, one with eyes full of stubborn fire, the other with the unblinking steadiness of someone who'd been forgotten too long and refused to be again. He smiled, not with joy, but with recognition. "The system doesn't like to be poked," he said, "but it needs it. It needs voices like yours, and evidence." He began gathering papers, stacking them carefully, slipping them into a fresh folder. "We'll write a formal report. Names, dates, a narrative. You two are going to give them a story they can't ignore." Cody tilted his head. "Like a story?" "Exactly like a story," Graham said, "except this one is true, and the characters still bleed." He handed each of them a copy of the district's complaint form. This goes to the Nevada State Bureau of Land and Rural Investigation. We'll also forward it to the sheriff's office, the district attorney, and the press if necessary. June's eyes lit with something sharp. So we're going public. If no one else will listen, Graham said, we make them. The bell rang, distant and hollow through the school intercom. But it sounded like a bell tower in a ghost town, finally daring to ring again after years of silence. Cody stood, clutching the folder like a torch. June beside him, notebook at the ready, Graham behind them, already typing. Outside, the desert wind had shifted. This time, it wasn't whispering secrets. It was carrying truth. The knock came at twilight. Randy didn't answer it right away. He stared at the door like it had grown teeth. Another knock sharper this time. Then the door creaked open on its own, like it remembered who used to own the silence. Paul Lewis stood in the frame, chewing on a toothpick, wearing a denim jacket too clean for someone who worked with livestock. His eyes, always calculating, glinted with something colder than curiosity. Evening, Randy. Randy rose slowly from his recliner, joints popping, stomach tight. What are you doing here? Paul stepped in without invitation, kicked the door shut behind him. Funny thing, he said, glancing around the cluttered trailer. I ran into Carson County's records clerk today. She told me there's been an inquiry about Boone, about that land. Randy stayed silent. Paul moved closer, slow, calm, like a rattlesnake in a warm breeze. Seems someone's been kicking up dust, asking questions, filing things. Someone young, someone named Cody. Randy swallowed hard. I told you I had it handled, he said. Paul laughed. You haven't had anything handled since the day Boone hit the dirt. He circled Randy like a predator. You think I don't know that boy's been sneaking around that ranch, digging through what we buried? You think I didn't hear about the damn horse? Randy's hands clenched into fists. Paul leaned in, close enough for his breath to smell like mint and menace. Let me make this simple. If that kid keeps going, I'll burn us both. You hear me? I will take you down with me. And trust me, Randy, between the drunk charges and the chain in that cave, they'll eat you alive before I ever touch a cell. Randy flinched. Paul tapped him lightly on the chest, mockingly. Your move, old friend. Then he turned and walked out, leaving behind a man hollowed by history. That night, Randy didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, bathed in the flicker of the overhead bulb. In front of him lay the second set of copies documents Cody thought were hidden in the base of the utility closet. Randy stared at them. Boone's photo, the contract, the check stub, the truth. And then, slowly, with trembling hands, he lit a match. The flame licked paper. History curled into ash. He fed it sheet by sheet, like an offering to a god he no longer believed in. Cody knew something was wrong the moment he stepped into the trailer after school. The air smelled like smoke and guilt. His dad wasn't in his usual chair. The television was off. The folder was gone. He ran to the closet, empty. No, he whispered. No, no, no. The back door opened and slammed shut. Randy appeared in the doorway, eyes red-rimmed and glassy. You burned them, Cody said, voice breaking. I had to, Randy murmured. You don't understand what that man is capable of. I don't care, Cody screamed. This wasn't just about Boone anymore, or Whisper. This was about me. You took my truth and turned it into smoke. Randy grabbed him by the shoulders, too hard. I'm trying to protect you. No, Cody said through gritted teeth. You're protecting him. Randy released him. You're done going to that ranch. Do you hear me? You don't get to tell me where I can. You're grounded. Cody laughed bitterly. You think this is about punishment? I think this is about survival, Randy said. Then he shoved Cody down the hall, opened the boy's bedroom door, and slammed it shut behind him. Cody heard the lock click. He was trapped. Across town, June waited outside the library, backpack slung over one shoulder, a fresh stack of maps and timelines in her hand. Cody was supposed to meet her at 6. By 7, she started pacing. By 7:30, she called his phone 3 times. No answer. By 8, she biked to the trailer, circling twice before peering through the window. She saw Randy pacing inside, mumbling to himself. But no sign of Cody. She checked the barn. Empty. She tapped on the glass. Nothing. Something was wrong. She slid her phone from her pocket and texted Mr. Graham. June. I think Cody's in trouble. His dad's locked him in. The files are gone. No reply. She texted again. June. We need help. Inside the bedroom, Cody sat on the floor, fists clenched. Moonlight filtered through a narrow crack in the blinds. The room was small, just a bed, a desk, a closet full of old winter coats. Nothing but memories in boxes. He moved to the window. Nailed shut. He turned to the closet. There, in the back, buried beneath a pile of old soccer trophies, was a shoebox he hadn't touched since his mom left. Inside it, folded in half, was the original copy of the envelope he'd found in Whisper's Maine. He'd forgotten he'd made a backup weeks ago, something Graham told him. Always keep the first truth. Tears flooded his eyes. They hadn't erased everything, not yet. He dug through his drawer and found a pencil, tore a page from an old sketch pad and started writing. To Mr. Graham, to the sheriff, to whoever would listen. He didn't know how he'd get out, but the truth wasn't done breathing, and neither was he. Outside, the desert howled, not with wind, but with the footsteps of something returning. The sound came just after midnight. A soft tap, then another, then a scrape along the window frame. Cody blinked awake in the darkness of his locked bedroom. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming until a flashlight beam flickered against the far wall, drawing a thin, wobbly circle across the ceiling. He bolted upright. Tap. He scrambled to the window. Through the streaked glass, June's silhouette came into view, perched atop a rusted patio chair, one hand waving, the other holding a multi-tool. He slid the window open half an inch. "What are you?" "Shh," she whispered. "Move back." Cody ducked low as she worked on the screws holding the frame shut. Her face, normally calm and steady, was set in iron tonight. Minutes passed. The final screw dropped with a dull thud, and she eased the window up. Cody didn't hesitate. He climbed out, barefoot on the cold aluminum chair, landing with a quiet thud in the patch of dry weeds below. His heart hammered. They didn't speak as they ran across the yard. They didn't have to. The barn waited like a ghost, its silhouette split by the moonlight. They slipped in through the back entrance, flashlights bobbing with each step. Cody moved first, hand trembling as he opened the trap door to the underground passage. The air below reeked of damp earth and time. "Ready?" he asked. June nodded. They descended. Whisper stood where they'd last seen him, his body thinner than ever, his legs trembling under his weight. The wounds from the chain had mostly closed, but the damage beneath the skin lingered. He raised his head slowly when he saw Cody. Cody's chest cracked open. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I shouldn't have left you here again." He moved closer, unlatched the makeshift rope harness he'd left earlier, and tied it gently around Whisper's neck. June steadied the flashlight, her free hand brushing against the wall, fingers finding the scrawled names and carvings from years ago, proof that people had once come here and stayed quiet. Not anymore. "We're going," Cody said. "No more cages, no more silence." It took all their strength to help Whisper climb out of the chamber. He stumbled, collapsed once at the base of the ramp, then pushed up again with a noise halfway between a grunt and a whinny. Outside, the desert stretched wide and silver under the moon. They moved in silence. 2 kids and a ghost of a horse. Across the pasture, past the edge of the rusted fence line, toward the old arroyo trail that ran behind the school. Then, halfway down the dirt road, Whisper staggered. His knees gave out. He collapsed with a heavy thud, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Cody dropped beside him, heart clenching. "Number no, come on, boy. Just a little farther." Whisper tried to rise, but his body betrayed him. He let out a hoarse, cracked breath and laid his head down in the dust. June knelt beside them. "He's too weak." Cody's chest tightened. They couldn't run anymore. Not like this. He slid to the ground, pressing his forehead gently to Whisper's elfer. "You don't have to run," Cody whispered. "We're not running. We're standing." His hands wrapped around the horse's neck, arms tightening. "We're going to stand right here," he said, louder now, voice rising. "We're going to stand, and we're going to speak. You hear me?" Whisper blinked, slow and tired. But in that blink, Cody saw it. The same glint as before. The reflection. The fire. The burning flame inside Whisper's eye, not from the moon or the stars, but from Cody's own flashlight, flickering beside them on the ground. A living mirror, not just of light, but of will, of resolve, of defiance. June watched, lips pressed into a line. She stood, pulled out her phone, and opened the camera. "Let them see," she said. The light from her phone haloed them, boy and horse sitting in the dust, framed by nothing but desert silence and open sky. She snapped a photo, then another, then video. Cody didn't move. He just kept whispering, not for escape, not for survival, but for truth. Behind them, on the hill above the dirt road, the wind picked up. The dry grass rustled like applause. Far in the distance, headlights flickered, growing brighter. And somewhere, though, no bell rang, a sound echoed in Cody's chest. A call, not to flee, but to fight, to stand still, to speak. The courthouse in Carson County had seen decades of sunsplit trials and drought-hardened witnesses. But that morning, it was different. The benches groaned with the weight of reporters, whispering residents, and curious strangers. The doors opened, not with dread, but with a shift. A gust. A change in the air. Cody walked in first, shirt tucked, hair combed, but still wind-ruffled, the desert dust refusing to leave him completely. June was at his side, her backpack replaced by a leather binder clutched tightly against her chest, and behind them, calm and composed like a man about to teach his final lesson, was Mr. Graham. Cameras clicked the moment they entered. Someone whispered, "That's the boy, that's the girl with the maps, and that's Elijah Jensen's old friend." Cody's heart beat like hooves again, but he didn't look away. At the front, the judge looked up from a manila file. "This hearing will determine whether the petition to reopen the Boone Ranch investigation has merit," she said flatly. "You may proceed." June's voice cracked the silence first. She read names, dates, inconsistencies. She pointed to original deeds, partial transfers, witness statements. Then she stepped back. Graham took over, explaining the timeline, the land dispute, the sudden disappearance of Boone, the flawed assumption of a travel accident that never aligned with the final sighting. "And this," he said, lifting the tattered photo, "was found knotted into the mane of a horse who had not seen sunlight in over a decade." Gasps rippled across the room. Cody stepped forward last. He didn't read. He didn't reference papers. He told a story about silence and dirt and blood that stains wood floors no matter how many times you sand it down. About a ghost in the ground and a boy who listened hard enough to hear it breathing. When he finished, the room was silent. No one moved. No one clapped. They didn't have to. The truth hung in the air like smoke from a funeral fire, impossible to ignore, heavier than any gavel. Then the back doors creaked open, and Whisper walked in, thin, limping slightly, but standing. Sheriff Nolan led him by the reins, solemn as a funeral procession. No words, no fanfare, just the soft thud of hooves on courtroom tile. The judge blinked, stunned. "What is this?" "The witness who never forgot," Graham said quietly. Whisper stopped at the center. He didn't neigh, he didn't flinch, he stood. And the room, every voice, every breath, every doubt, fell away. It wasn't just a horse, it was evidence. Living, breathing, suffering, proof that someone had locked the truth in a cave and fed it silence. Randy sat at the back of the courtroom, slouched, hands between his knees. His face was unreadable, but something in his shoulders had softened. For once, he didn't reek of alcohol or fear. He clutched a folded envelope in his lap. It was unmarked. Inside was a confession signed, dated, written by a man who could no longer bear the weight of what he buried. He had slipped it through the door slot of the district attorney's office the night before the whiskey, before the darkness. No one knew it yet, but it was there, already waiting. Back in the courtroom, the judge cleared her throat. "This is unusual," she said, voice softer now. "But sometimes, justice arrives in unusual ways." She looked down at the reports, the signatures, the chain of evidence. "I am approving the motion to reopen the Boone Ranch case under formal investigation." Gasps. Whispers. Cody didn't smile. He turned to Whisper instead, placed a hand on the stallion's trembling shoulder. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," he said. "Not for the room, not for the press, but for the horse who never looked away." And Whisper, steady, turned his head slightly, just enough for his eye to catch the courtroom light. The glint returned, not of flame, not of reflection, but of relief. The courtroom lights were unforgiving that afternoon, white and sharp, like truth after a long darkness. Paul Lewis adjusted his tie 3 times in the witness box. Each time, his fingers trembled slightly. But not from fear. Paul didn't rattle. He calculated. The prosecutor stood a few feet away, holding up the envelope that had been found inside Whisper's mane. "Mr. Lewis," she said evenly, "are you familiar with this?" Paul leaned forward, squinted like the writing was foreign. "Looks like some old ranch paperwork," he said coolly. "Probably forged. That boy Cody, right? He's clearly disturbed, likely projecting fantasies. Happens all the time in trauma cases." "Trauma cases," the prosecutor echoed, "where children unearth bodies buried by men like you?" Paul chuckled, polite. "Come on, a 9-year-old kid says he found a murder confession in a horse's mane? You're taking that seriously?" Someone in the jury flinched. "Let's go over this again," she said, motioning toward the overhead projector. A scan of the documents appeared on screen-yellowed papers, Boone's signature, land agreements, timelines. "This set," she continued, "matches a missing archive folder from Boone Ranch Holdings, a folder that disappeared the same month Mr. Boone was reported missing." She turned to the jury. "It wasn't a ghost story. It was a cover-up." Paul laughed again, but it rang hollow now. He leaned into the mic. "That boy's got a hero complex. Thought he could save the day, ride in with a damn horse like some cowboy bedtime story." Silence. The prosecutor said nothing. Instead, she turned toward the back. The doors opened again, just slightly. An officer stepped through with a report folder. The prosecutor held it up. "This," she said, "is a copy of the forensic trace done on the rope recovered from the Whisper site. Soil residue places it at the Boone property. Fibers match remnants found on Mr. Boone's last known clothing. And the partial fingerprint on the clasp?" She paused. "Paul Lewis." "Confirmed." Gasps again. Even the judge's mouth opened slightly before she masked it with her hand. Paul froze. His confidence cracked, not exploded, but bent, like iron under heat. Still, he spoke. "I didn't kill Boone. I didn't touch him." "No," the prosecutor said quietly. "But you knew, and you helped erase him." She let the words settle like ash. The judge nodded toward the defense. Paul's lawyer asked to recess. Denied. A bailiff whispered into the prosecutor's ear. She turned to the judge. "We request to call a voluntary witness." From the corner of the courtroom, Randy stood. The room held its breath. His hands were tucked into his pockets. His hair was combed, his eyes sober. "I'm not a hero," he began, stepping into the aisle. "Never been one. I've spent most of my life trying to outrun silence. Drown it, really." He looked at Cody, then at Paul. "I was there the night Boone was killed. I didn't swing anything, but I stood there, and I helped hide the proof." He stepped closer to the stand. "I was the one who chained Whisper down there. Not Paul. Not alone, at least." Murmurs erupted. The judge banged her gavel once. Randy didn't flinch. "I told myself I was protecting my family, but the truth is, I was just scared of being the next man to disappear." His voice cracked, for the first time in 20 years. "But I'm not going to let that fear be something my son inherits. I won't pass it down like bad blood or broken teeth." He looked straight at the jury. "I chained that horse," he said, "but I'm not letting my boy wear the shackles." The courtroom fell silent again. It was Graham who stood next, placing a hand gently on Cody's shoulder. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "we request full investigation into Mr. Lewis and potential immunity consideration for Mr. Randy Nolan in light of his confession and cooperation." The judge stared at Randy for a long moment, then nodded. Granted, a decision that began with a horse's eye had cracked open an entire county's denial. Outside, reporters circled like vultures. Inside, Whisper was being transported by local vet teams to a specialized equine clinic outside Carson City. Cody had watched him go with a soft touch on the muzzle and a whisper. "Rest now. It's our turn." The verdict came down under the gray morning light, soft and unassuming, like Nevada sky before a storm. Paul Lewis stood with his hands clenched, his jaw locked in defiance as the judge's voice echoed across the room. "Paul Edward Lewis, this court finds you guilty of obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and accessory after the fact in the death and concealment of Richard Boone." Cody sat still, fingers wrapped tightly around June's purter. The pressure of the moment vibrated through his bones. The judge continued, "You will be remanded to Carson County Correctional Facility pending sentencing." Paul didn't speak, didn't blink. He turned his eyes to Cody as he was let out. But there was no threat left in them, only the look of a man who had spent his whole life stacking silence like bricks, only to watch a boy tear it down with truth. The room turned as Randy rose next, standing beside his court-appointed attorney. He looked thinner, older, but lighter, somehow. "For your role in the concealment of material evidence," the judge said, "and in recognition of your voluntary confession, ongoing cooperation, and lack of direct violence, this court sentences you to 18 months of community rehabilitation and restorative justice service under supervised probation." He nodded once. No arguments, no theatrics, just the quiet surrender of a man finally free of his own chains. Cody turned to see Graham close his notebook slowly, his eyes wet but proud. And then the next decision came, not expected, not traditional, but needed. The judge looked directly at Cody. "Given the dissolution of current guardianship and in consideration of the restorative interest of all parties involved," she said, "and at the recommendation of both Child Services and the Boone family attorney, we rule that Cody Nolan will be placed under permanent guardianship of Eleanor Boone and her granddaughter, Rachel Boone." The room stilled. Cody blinked. Mrs. Boone stood in the back, thin frame wrapped in a green shawl that looked older than the courthouse itself. Beside her stood Rachel, late 20s, eyes sharp but warm, her hand on her grandmother's arm. The judge nodded gently. "This is not a reward. This is restoration." As they approached, Cody rose to his feet. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached out, pulling him gently into a fragile, unshakable embrace. "You," she whispered, voice cracking, "are the kind of son my Richard never had the time to protect." She held him tighter. "And I will protect you, with every breath I've got left." Cody didn't know if he cried. He only felt a weight shift inside him, like something wounded had been lifted and replaced with warmth. Rachel placed a hand on his back. "Come on, little brother, let's go find Whisper." They stepped out into the courthouse steps, where the press buzzed like cicadas. Flashes blinked, questions flew, but Cody wasn't listening. His eyes locked on a figure beyond the crowd. Whisper, standing, not restrained, no halter, no chain, just a soft breeze moving through his white mane. A symbol of everything buried and broken, now standing tall, scarred, Yes, but unbound. Whisper turned his head. One eye caught the light. The fire was still there, but this time, it was peace. Rachel whispered beside him. He's free now. Cody stepped forward slowly, the distance shrinking between him and the soul who had never left him alone in that darkness. When he reached Whisper, he raised a hand. Not to hold, not to guide, just to touch. Whisper leaned in, and in that single, still moment, neither of them had to say a word. There are sunsets in Nevada that bleed gold, where the land burns amber, and the wind carries more than just dust, it carries memory. And that evening, Cody rode Whisper across the open plain like a ghost returning home. Whisper moved with purpose now. Though his ribs still showed, and his gait still bore the weight of old chains, there was no hesitation, no fear. The boy on his back had carried him out of darkness. Now he carried the boy forward toward light. They galloped past the newly painted fences of Boone Ranch. What was once a husk of a forgotten place choked by weeds, boarded windows, silence now stood in motion. The barn had been rebuilt, its doors wide open. The old sign above the gate read, Boone Ranch, Equine Therapy and Renewal Center. Children's laughter rang from a distant paddock. And in the corral, standing tall with a whistle in her mouth and her boots planted like oak roots, June called out to a pair of wild colts. She looked older somehow, even though it had only been a few months. She was now the youngest certified youth horse trainer in Carson County. Her voice rose above the dust. That's it. Let them trust you before you try to lead. Cody waved as he passed, and June just shook her head and grinned. Don't go stealing my thunder, cowboy, he laughed. A full, easy laugh that came from somewhere he didn't know he had. Later that night, as the sky turned velvet and stars lit up like sparks from heaven, Cody sat by the fire outside the main house. The wind tugged gently at the envelope in his hand. It was postmarked from the Reno Rehabilitation Farm. Randy's letters came on the first Monday of every month. He opened this one slowly. Son, I still hear your footsteps in the house, even though you're not there. But I don't drink to silence anymore. I listen to it now. It's not empty, it's full of what I need to hear. I spend most of my time cleaning out stalls, fixing fences. Yesterday, I helped a teenage boy groom his first horse. His name's Felix. The boy, not the horse. You'd like him. I'm not proud of what I did. But I'm proud of who you are. You're the kind of man I never became. And, just so you know, I don't chain anything anymore. Not even memories. Run, son. Run like you were meant to. Dad. Cody folded the letter, heart pounding with something too wide for his chest. Inside the main house, Eleanor Boone read silently by the window, the same shawl on her shoulders. Rachel poured tea beside her, glancing out at the boy on the porch, her expression full of something resembling peace. On the bookshelf behind them sat a newly published hardcover, Whisper, The Truth Beneath the Dust, by Graham Elijah Jensen. Its cover bore the image of Whisper's face, half in shadow, half in light, just like the world he had walked through. In the months since the trial, the story had spread beyond Carson City. People from out of state wrote letters. Schools invited Graham to speak. Donations came in. Survivors, once silent, found their way to Boone Ranch, drawn not by sympathy, but by the echo of something they'd known too well, captivity and the long road out of it. What had once been a place of hidden cruelty was now a sanctuary, not just for horses, but for wounded youth, children who flinched at loud sounds, who had forgotten what it felt like to be touched without fear, now brushed manes, whispered to stallions, and learned to ride without reins. Cody became their symbol, not the leader, not the savior. Just proof that you could rise from the bottom of the earth with truth in your pocket and walk back into the sun. One afternoon, a girl named Maddie, age 12, who hadn't spoken a word in weeks, reached out and touched Whisper's face. She didn't say anything. She just cried, and Whisper, still and calm, let her lean into him. That evening, Cody took Whisper to the ridge overlooking the valley. The wind danced through the grasses. The sky was dipped in firelight. He dismounted and stood beside his horse. With one slow, quiet motion, he raised his hand toward the sun. Light poured through his fingers, and beside him, Whisper turned his head. His eyes caught the glow, but they didn't reflect sorrow anymore. Not chains, not fear, just something wild and open and endless. Something alive. Whisper no longer whispered. He breathed. He stood. And, for the first time in years, he simply lived.